And now, Julemi.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for having me here. I'm really happy to be here, part of this conversation. I am currently a crisis intervention specialist with the Family Violence Law Center. And one of the things that I do is um, answer the crisis line. So when I do that, I interact with clients on a daily basis. So I'm hoping to share some insight as to some of the things that our survivors are lacking, and hopefully, propose solutions to fill in those gaps.
And Sadia Khan.
Hi, everyone. Thank you guys for having me here. And it's wonderful to be here with such a wonderful panel of experts. I am Sadia Khan. I'm a policy advocate. I use she, her pronouns. And I think for myself, coming from a policy background and a community organizing background, I think the one thing I really want to emphasize in today's conversation is around just the various nuances within domestic violence. There are so many things that fall under this umbrella, and oftentimes we get used to just the one definition that we know, and we leave everything else out. And there's a lot of danger to that. Just like Jen mentioned and everybody else mentioned, there's so many different, impacts, and the reach is beyond just the individual that's directly impacted, but it reaches their family, their loved ones, their friends, and so on and so forth. And to really tackle these issues, we have to come from a, community-based, survivor-centered approach. And I think that's what I feel like I heard from everyone here. So yeah, that's what I'd like to bring to this.
Okay, so I'm going to start with our first question, which is, how can we frame or reframe the conversation about domestic violence in a way that resonates with the general public? And so, again, we're talking about how we have this conversation about domestic violence and other forms of gender-based violence, because that's one of the things that we recognized in when we did some of this work before, is that the term gender-based violence doesn't necessarily resonate with everyone in the community. So, do we need to reframe the conversation? How do we talk about domestic violence in ways that the community understands and can start to sort of vibe with us? So I'd like to start with Kosaria.
Thank you. So, I wonder about the reframing, because I also think that, and I'm sure it's the same, having been a fellow FVLC person before, I'm sure it's the same in many of your organizations and in the company you keep, that when you bring in someone new, so a community member, a new organization, whoever they might be, they often are really surprised by the full work and scope of what we cover and what we all do and what that looks like. And so I think that I wonder if it's reframing as much as we're not really great at pushing out and talking about what we do and knowing what it takes to both end gender-based violence, but also to interrupt. And so I wonder if we need to do a better job around pushing out and talking about the entirety of what we do, which I'm thankful to be in this space where you're doing just that. The other piece I will say is that we often don't talk about what we're trying to achieve and the health and wellness in our communities that we are contributing to achieving. And so we sometimes don't understand the end goal or help people understand what the end goal is. And then, and obviously, and I'm sure this is covered somewhere in your lunch and learns on a regular basis, but the stats already back us up about the need, right? The statistics already show that almost everybody around us in any circumstance whatsoever has touched this work, right? Has touched this issue in gender-based violence. And so, and that it doesn't matter, right? Socioeconomic status, it doesn't matter. Gender, it doesn't matter sexual orientation. Like, there's so many pieces to this. And so with that, given that that everyone has touched it, I think that we have to talk to people about what they can do about it. And I think that that is the struggle that often people have, is like they might know it in their family, they might see it, they might recognize it generationally, but they don't know what to do. And how do we interrupt, and talking about how do we interrupt unhealthy cycles? How do we interrupt in both our community and our families, and deal with the systems that perpetuate those cycles and keep people in cycles of poverty and oppression. So I will stop talking so my lovely panelists can join in.
Okay, Julemi? And just a reminder, talking about reframing or framing the conversation about domestic violence in a way that resonates with the community.
Yeah, I think what Kosaria was referring to is that sometimes people perceive domestic violence solely as physical violence, which can make it challenging to engage people in meaningful conversations about the issue. Some may avoid discussing or domestic violence because they feel like they're intruding on someone's private life, or they struggle to empathize due to having a victim blaming attitude. So they may think that the issue doesn't affect them, or they may not know what to do, right? So it's kind of difficult to spark interest in a topic that may seem irrelevant to people's own experiences. So in order to make this resonate more broadly, I think that we should expand the conversation beyond physical violence and intimate partner relationships, like Evelyn was saying in her introduction, and highlight other forms of DV to emphasize the long-lasting impacts that it has on individuals, on families, and communities. So by shifting the perception from only, violence with between two people, we can help people get a deeper understanding of domestic violence. And we can also humanize the issue by using like real life examples, things that we come across on a daily basis. And that could help raise awareness about other forms of violence. And also it may also connect with people that have faced violence but don't consider themselves as survivors, as well as people who view domestic violence as a private conflict rather than a community issue. And lastly, I would say emphasizing the importance of supporting survivors and educating the community on how to hold abusers accountable, and letting people know that this is something that could affect anyone regardless of identity. So it's crucial for people to be informed about it.
Evelyn, can you talk about framing the conversation about domestic violence, or reframing the conversation in the context of prevention?
Yes, of course. I would first love to echo a lot of what Kosaria and Julemi were saying. Those are really great points. In the context of prevention, if you think about the word or the concept domestic violence, it has a history, a very gendered history, a history that makes us think about a heterosexual relationship between a man and a woman. But if we really break that apart, domestic violence doesn't just happen in the home, or does not start in the home. It has to do with the relationships that we have with ourselves, the relationships that we have with those around us, with our communities, with our friends, with our teachers, with other adults in our lives. So when we want to reframe domestic violence, I would say we need to think about not only intimate partner violence, but also violence that happens to someone because of their gender. And that doesn't only happen to women, but it also happens to queer and trans folks. It happens to men. And that is where we often come to a limitation, that when we think about domestic violence, we think about romantic violence. We think about violence between two people who are in an intimate relationship. And we also need to understand that there is not a binary between a survivor and someone who causes abuse. We are often within that cycle, outside that cycle, and in cycles with other people that might put us in different positions in that cycle. So for example, if you're in a relationship with someone where you are experiencing harm, that might lead you to want to feel control in other relationships, which might then you might go and maybe use power or control over someone else. Or if you are at a workplace where you don't have rights, where you're not treated right, then that anger and frustration might often come out on your friends, on your children, on your partner. So when we think about reframing domestic violence, we need to think about having healthy relationships. We need to think about close-knit communities. We need to think about having the basic needs to survive. And that includes a living wage, that includes stable housing, that includes the life skills to be able to navigate the different systems within which we live, as well as knowing what it is to have a healthy relationship, how to have healthy conflict, how to have boundaries, not only with ourselves, but those around us. And I will leave it at that so I can let others share as well.
Jen, can you talk to us about how we can frame or reframe the conversation about domestic violence in a way that resonates with the community?
First of all, I just want to say there's very little I can add. The panelists have not already called out. These answers are so robust and gorgeous. I don't even want to step on them. But what I do want to call out, Tisha, is we have been asking ourselves this question for like 30 years. And if we can get it squared away in this meeting, hot dog. This is an incredible time well spent. I think that we still struggle with the idea of it's something that happens to me, to you, to us. It is something that happens out there to somebody else. And you know, and touching on the idea that DV is physical when we know that that's not the case. Sometimes we fall into this trap of like, well, this DV is worse than this other kind, and so I really shouldn't talk about it, or I don't really need help because my suffering, my oppression wasn't as bad as what somebody else went through. There's a lot of work for us to do in that space, in pulling on those threads and to say, no, you, all of us get to live our lives as fully autonomous, free people, not being oppressed by someone, not being manipulated, not being controlled. That is something that should be available to all of us. And yes, I just want to honor what's already been said rather than try to pile on top of it.
Sadia, talk to us a little bit about how we can frame or reframe the conversation about domestic violence in a way that resonates with the general public, keeping in mind prevention and intervention in simplified terms.
Yeah, I feel like Jen said, everybody's already given wonderful definitions and answers. I think the only thing I'd like to touch on a tad more, especially in the terms of prevention, is, violence and domestic violence and gender-based violence impact really anyone and everyone. And I think until we start destigmatizing the shame that comes with having experienced any form of violence, we cannot push forward and we cannot empower people to seek the support that they need or to break cycles of violence. I've come across far too many survivors that I've supported myself who, felt like what they were going through just wasn't domestic violence because they didn't put their hands on me, or they only controlled my finances. But they weren't, physically hurting me or calling me names, but they controlled every financial aspect of my life, from the paycheck that I received to, whatever I need to pay out on any bills and so forth, to, just what I was able to purchase. There's so many different ways in which domestic violence shows up for different people. And we as a society have gotten used to, just putting these cookie cutter definitions on people and saying, if you don't fit all of these 5 things, you're not facing domestic violence, or it's not urgent enough for me to support you right now. I need to support someone that's facing it more urgently. And so until we step away from those kind of definitions, until we start bringing it all in and, removing the shame of, the fact that someone took advantage of you, or that somebody violated you, whether it's physically, whether it's emotionally, whether it's through different means, whether it's through manipulating your friend groups, whether it's through trying to convince you that they are the center of your universe and you don't need any friends, you don't need family, that you only need to rely on that one person. Until we start talking about this stuff in a way where we don't bring shame to people, but we empower them to see, like, yes, this happened to you, but you are not a bad person, or you are not damaged, or you are not, these are the things that survivors are often told when they try to seek help from individuals who may not be used to serving communities that are facing domestic violence. So I'm not speaking about like gender DV advocates or direct service support. I'm talking about if you go to a friend and you say, hey, I am dealing with X, Y, and Z, and they tell you, oh, it's fine, you're just overthinking it. Unfortunately, when we end up seeking support from people who are not familiar with these types of topics, we end up either being gaslit or shamed or told to just stay patient. That's something we see a lot of in religious communities, where people will say, just be patient, it'll get better, or, just have a kid, it'll get better. And these things are not the solutions, that a survivor needs in the moment. The other thing I want to kind of touch on that needs reframing is, what does support for a survivor look like? I think oftentimes it's this idea that it has to be short-term, immediate, we got you out of that physical, place of violence, or that, just whatever that immediate crisis prevention is, but we don't look at supporting survivors in the long term. The trauma that's going to come up 10 years from now because you are finding yourself in a similar situation, or you are, being harassed by that individual, social media, all of these kind of like technology advances have made it so much easier for abusers to continue tapping in and trying to harm survivors. And so until we start looking at these things a little bit more deeply, we, fail to see that sometimes this abuse lasts more than just that, moment, more than just 2 years from now, more than just 3 years from now. I feel like come across, issues of revenge porn where people will, upload that 3 years after the relationship has ended, after somebody has moved out of state and they're no longer in contact. All of that kind of stuff has happened, but, abusers will still find methods and ways to try to exert control over the person they are harming, and no physical or technological barrier is going to, stop them until we actively look at, like full nuanced support. We can't just provide support in one area and not, the other areas in which a survivor is also impacted. So we have to look at just the word is slipping my mind, comprehensive support. It can't just be in one area. It has to be comprehensive. We have to look at all the areas in which a survivor is impacted. And if it's something that's going to be long-term or short-term or whatever it might be, we have to look at all of those different areas, and, frame our support with those things in mind.
Well, you walked right into my next question, and so I'm gonna I'm gonna ask Kosaria to add on to common misunderstandings about domestic violence or survivors or providers that you would like to clarify for our audience based on your expertise. Because I think Sadia did walk into some of those conversations. So thank you for moving that forward.
Thank you. So what I will just say is the common misunderstandings are still the same things in the last 30 years. Jen mentioned how long this has been. Thanks, Jen, for remembering how old I am. Some of the same conversations that we've been is this idea that it's easy to leave a relationship that is abusive. And it means that you have recognized and you can recognize what abuse looks like. And by abuse, I mean our sort of definition of abuse, which is not everyone's definition of abuse. And it's definitely not our definition of abuse when we're actually in the relationship that we're in. and particularly when we're in a relationship that we love and that we love someone and that meets other needs in our lives. And so we could spend this entire hour talking about the reasons why people do not leave, instead of really thinking in depth about why intimate partner violence or gender-based violence happens in the first place. And so, you know, I would say that leads me to the other piece, which is one of our great colleagues in this work, Growing a New Heart, uses the phrase, you know, that everyone deserves to be in a relationship that is safe to leave, right? You should be in a relationship that is safe to argue. It is safe to disagree. It is safe to have dreams and self-efficacy and make decisions and think through things, and that is not the case. And so, and some of that becomes physical violence in many relationships, but it doesn't. It doesn't have to be physical, right? As my colleagues have already covered. The piece that I would like to really think about, the common misunderstanding in a lot of our work, is that we only need to work with survivors, with folks that have already experienced harm, and that's not the case at all. That we actually need to work with everyone, and I do mean everyone. So that includes folks who cause harm and what that looks like in relationships. And I think Evelyn, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, Evelyn, by any means, but really hit home to me when you were talking about that's all of us at some point in some time in our relationships, to some extent, are not always healthy. We don't just naturally always know how to regulate, and that so many things are learned and around us, and that take relearning. And so thinking about what's healthy in a healthy relationship and what that looks like. And so to that point, when we're thinking about folks that cause harm, we really believe heavily that there are abusive values that take place in a relationship, and it's really those values that we're confronting and that we're dealing with, and the behavior related to those values, which means that everyone has the ability to be a healthy human, everyone. And so that means there's a lot of work that we all have to do. So when we're really working with everyone, that means everyone. And so what does that look like in our organizations, but really more importantly, I think in our communities? And then lastly, I will say, and then I will leave it to all of my beautiful colleagues here to say, is that I think another large misunderstanding that is the top of mind is that most of the work involved from service providers is focused on shelter. And the truth of the matter is that is not the bulk of our work. Sometimes the more expensive part of our work, but it's not the bulk of our work. And yes, of course, we absolutely always, until we end it, we absolutely do need safe emergency housing. And that is not the bulk of our work. As an organization that receives over 15,000 crisis calls a year, and just our organization alone, the bulk of the folks that are calling us are not looking for shelter. The bulk of the folks that are calling and walking in the doors and contacting us through email, which is not in any of those numbers, those folks are looking for support in some sort of way. They're looking for understanding. They're looking for they're looking for places to heal, places to begin to think through. They're looking to see if they're crazy, their words, not mine, with what is happening in their lives. They're looking for understanding. And we are able to provide a myriad of other things as advocates in this work. And I don't need to list them all out, but because I'm sure they're on FELC's website, but like, as well as all of ours, but they are places we are truly seeing people come at all aspects of their relationship, at all aspects of healing, at all aspects of recognizing that something that's not right in some capacity, some way, somehow, has happened. And so the bulk of us service providers operate in that space, and shelter is this really small minutia piece of what we do, and it's even the small minutia of the housing support we do. And so just wanted to call that out as another misunderstanding.
Evelyn and Julemi, one of the questions that sort of has come up for me is, what are the ways that we can improve cultural competence as service providers to survivors who've experienced violence? And I think within that question, thinking outside of the box and not just about ethnic and racial and culture in that way, but also thinking about what is youth culture? What is culture in the Bay Area versus culture in LA, for example? When we think about cultural competence, sometimes we might keep it in a small box, but let's expand that. So how do we serve survivors, or how do we work as preventionists and be linguistically competent and also understand the various kinds of cultures that we come in contact with? So let's start with Evelyn on that.
I would say that cultural competency first and foremost comes with awareness, knowledge, and the skills to be in spaces with the community members which we serve. So meeting people where they are, learning about the different terms and the different ever-changing language that they're using and what they mean. I know that to some of us, what the younger people now are using means something completely different than what we learned when we were growing up. So really understanding, like, what are people experiencing? Like, what is their everyday life looking like? How do they communicate with each other? How do they want us to communicate with them? And really developing the skills to be able to understand that there's a diversity of cultures within cultures. There is no single monoculture, and our experiences shape the way that we show up in the world, the way that we interact with each other, the way that we not only like experience the world, but talk to people. So really broadening our skills and understanding around how can we start asking questions instead of just offering the services or saying this is what we have to offer, but more asking what is going on with you? What do you need? What can I provide? How can I support? And making sure that our services are being translated to the language with which they speak, making sure that our organizations have historically mostly been filled by people who identify as female. So making sure that we are diversifying that, making sure that we are hiring people of diverse genders and identities. So we start to normalize that violence does not only happen to women. Violence does not only happen to female identifying people. Violence happens to everyone. So I would say start asking more questions and really understand and take what you learn from the people that we're serving and integrate that into the different policies, different systems, different practices in our organizations and in the way that we show up in the world.
Julemi, talk to us a little bit about cultural competence because you're doing direct service work. So it's important for us to really think about who's calling the crisis line.
Yeah, so I think a way to improve cultural competence as a service provider would be to engage ourselves in ongoing reflection, education, and training, because things are always changing, right? And we also need to stay informed and up to date about the new things and the new practices, right? And reflecting on the way that we interact with clients is crucial, especially if we're new to the field. Learning how to give ourselves feedback and how to improve on those areas. And I think it's also very important to approach this work with an open mind and willingness to continually learn about yourself and about the people that you interact with, whether they're clients or they're your peers. especially here in the Bay Area, we come across people from different cultures and that have different situations, right? And we need to be able to understand how their cultural background shaped their experience and use that to tailor our approach. And yeah, that will help us kind of not use cookie cutter for everyone, like approaching everyone the same way, taking the time to actually listen actively to understand where this person comes from. Because there may be somebody that is from the same culture, but they may have different skills. They may have they are, like Evelyn said, like cultures within a culture, or there may be different practices. So we need to actively listen to the people that we're working with, to understand them and know how to approach them, and how their background really shapes how they perceive the information and how they experience violence. And also, I think that it's also important to always take in time to research and learn and appreciate the different cultures and the different practices, right? And also learning about the history, especially if it's something that you come across that you're unfamiliar with, like me on the crisis line. Sometimes people call with different languages. Sometimes it's been times where we didn't know the language, or we see an influx in like people calling, asking for specific language. So my role as a service provider will make sure that I communicate that with my supervisor, so they know how to implement a new way to communicate with this influx of clients. And I think it's also important to being open to feedback from survivors themselves too, because they're the ones that we're serving, and it's really important that we have something in place like that. I know we don't do that here, but I know that there are other crisis lines that do have like a survey at the end of the call, or like give feedback. And I think that's also important, you know. It takes a lot of reflection and self-initiative to be cultural competent. Thank you.
Thank you, Julemi. And I know Kosaria kind of walked us into this question about housing. And so I'm going to start with Jennifer, and then Kosaria, if you want to add anything. But let's talk a little bit about housing. So my question definitely assumes that we know that there are system failures with respect to survivors accessing housing. So let's talk about the system failures in terms of affordable housing, and how we relate to that as service providers to survivors of domestic violence.
Well, that's a big topic. So, well, let's start off with first, and just to recognize there's not enough affordable housing to meet the need here in California. And I don't know if we have people tuning in from other states, maybe it's the same there, but in California, we have not rallied our resources enough to meet the existing need. And so we start this conversation with a deficit, and then we add survivors into this mix. And there is there are the service providers that are trauma informed and amazing and doing incredible work. And they're doing this work inside of a system that is itself not necessarily trauma informed, that assumes we go from point A to point B, and it's this lovely straight line. And all this person needs is like their resume redone, and someone to talk to them about how to open a bank account, and all that. That person might need a resume, and they might need, like, all of that can be true. But the survivor experience is very often a little more squiggly. And when we have a system that is based on getting people, either preventing them from going into the system in the first place, or getting them out ASAP and into permanent housing, which we do not have enough of, it puts providers in this box where it becomes very hard for them to navigate. It becomes very hard for survivors to navigate. And the more a survivor is sitting at various intersections the more stuff they have on their plate to navigate through, the harder that is. And so that then puts people in a position of cherry picking of who can we serve, who can we get housed with this limited amount that I have, what can I do with it? And then the challenge in that is, are we serving the people that need it the most with our limited resources? And that is this razor thin line survivors traverse every single day. And there's a path forward out of that. I think it requires a tremendous amount of advocacy and patience and love. I don't think it's an option for us as DV providers to simply not engage with these systems, because these systems aren't going to shift if we don't show up. But also recognizing that this work in 2024 is survivor driven in a lot of places. And thank goodness for that, but recognizing that's an additional emotional labor that we're asking of people to engage in. And we need to spread that work out so it's not all falling on one group's shoulders to carry. So, Kawsari, I don't know if you have more you want to add to that. I'm always happy to rant about housing.
I think Jen and I have spent a lot of our time talking about housing. What I will add to is, again, is a little bit of what I said before, is that housing is not always an emergency function, but is yet a necessary piece of the puzzle for everyone to feel like they can thrive in this world. And so when you add into survivors, like, we don't want anyone to ever feel trapped due to circumstance, inclusive of abusive circumstances, right? And so we actually see that survivors need affordable housing from the stance of not necessarily starting from a starting place of shelter, but from a place of options and opportunity, from a place of, dignity and the ability to actually have the job that they want to have, or to live the life that they should be able to live. And I just want to say, while we're talking about all of it, like, we all live and work in these nonprofits that struggle day in and day out to ensure that our staff can have access to affordable housing on their end in the Bay Area. So it's a huge issue here in California for everyone. And so overall, I think that the system in and of itself has already said this is not super important, right? And we are in this space where our systems and even our elected leaders often feel very strongly, specifically about folks that are living on the street. And that is the focus. And the focus is often interim housing or shelters, essentially, right? The not affordable housing, not actual livable, ongoing housing that people can access and keep and afford and actually have some stability in their lives. And that's a problem. That's a problem, but it's also a very usual issue when it comes to systems. You're going to focus on what's right in front of your face all the time and not address any of the actual the foundational issues. So you're not going to, we treat the symptom, right, and not the problem. And so we don't have things focused on ensuring that people aren't in poverty and aren't literally and are able to have access to, real financial assistance in life and resources for themselves and their families, and housing and food. And, it's total Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We are still on the very basic bottom. And it keeps us in this part of fighting for justice. So we never really quite reach the place to get to where Evelyn and Sadia was talking about, where we're really over here trying to reach the place of, health and wellness and for ourselves, our community, our families. And it's hard to do because we're focused on making sure people have basic needs, and affordable housing, unfortunately, is still very much a basic need. in California, and a resource that sometimes feels completely unattainable.
My next question is again about some missing pieces to this puzzle. Jen, Julemi, and Sadia, I'd like you also to weigh in on this. What are some missing pieces in the services that we are able to provide or we are funded to provide to survivors? And we'll start with Jennifer.
I want to sound like such an ED right now because the first thing that comes to mind is the money to pay for the services. I think every person sitting on this panel, probably every person sitting on this call, knows there are gaps within their organization, within their services, and they can see a path towards how to bridge that gap if only there was this additional money. And so I would then add to that there's a certain lack of political will to fully fund the work that we do. And we saw this with the VOCA shenanigans. We see this with prevention funding in California and how that is not ongoing. There is this lack of political will to really lean in to solving this issue. And that trips us up so often.
Okay, Julemi, can you add in and talk to us about some missing pieces?
Yeah, like Jennifer said, that there are definitely some notable gaps in the services that clients currently receive. And although we do have resources available, they're insufficient to meet the high demand, at least here in the Bay Area. And some of the services that survivors often lack are housing, mental health support, and financial assistance. And there's no streamlined process that offers them comprehensive wraparound services, which is a huge problem because survivors face significant challenges when trying to leave a relationship or an abusive situation, especially if they lack a stable income to support themselves. And also, like, if they have any children that they may be taking care of while they're seeking legal remedies. So access to these resources is crucial for them to achieve self-sufficiency and actually break out of the cycle of violence. Because many struggle to move forward if they haven't addressed like the trauma that they face, for example. You know, it makes them more vulnerable to being re-victimized. And these are things that are essential for someone to thrive. And especially here in California, you know, all of these things, I feel like they're there, but they need to be evaluated. And I really do think there needs to be a system where we offer wraparound services. So like if somebody goes through DV, there should be offered like ongoing support rather than just like that intervention, quick turnaround service. Yeah.
And Sadia, I'd like you to weigh in on this, and I'd specifically like you to talk a little bit about forced and child marriage. I know that's this paper that you have worked on about forced and child marriage, which also falls under the umbrella of DV. Can you talk a little bit about some of the missing pieces in that survivors of forced marriage might be missing?
I can only laugh because where do I even start with that? I mean, the reality is the services are close to non-existent because people, one, don't understand it as an issue under this, you know, massive umbrella of domestic violence. I mean, for one, there are some services that exist, very minimal, but those are more so geared towards survivors who are under the age of 18. So there's already this assumption that only individuals who are under the age of 18 can be impacted by forced marriage, when even the statistics that the US has states that forced marriage impacts the majority of individuals in the US who are impacted by forced marriage are between the ages of 13 and 34. So we're anybody above the age of 18 or 17 really and up, we're leaving them completely high and dry, and figure it out. How could you as an adult have even allowed yourself to be forced into a marriage? Like, that's kind of the attitude that we have as the US, because we're not even considering them as survivors. So the first thing really is just the complete lack of awareness that this issue exists in the US, that this is not just issue that impacts the global south or non-Western countries. Like this, that's a huge barrier we need to overcome before we can even start to really look at what kind of services are necessary. I've met so many survivors who couldn't access a shelter, couldn't access funding, couldn't access really any services from typical shelters because they didn't quite fit into what was considered domestic violence, because their forced marriage, no physical violence had taken place yet. The fact that this individual was being told that the act of them being forced into a marriage does not constitute any form of violence, like that again is another problem. And so when we're looking at what kind of services we need or what's missing is, we need to completely, people need to be educated on what the issue is, on how prevalent it is in the US, particularly California, where over 8,800 individuals are forced into marriage every single year. We're talking close to 9,000 people that are forced into marriages in California, and we're doing absolutely nothing. When our agency itself spoke to lawmakers about this, we were told, oh, well, that's not a significant number for California, so we don't think it's an urgent issue that lawmakers need to address. Beyond that, housing is obviously a clear one. How can you safely exit this type of a situation if you don't have a safe home? If your family may be involved in the forced marriage, then even your home is not a safe space for you to be in. Mental health services, there's typically a lot of trauma, whether it's religious manipulation, whether it's emotional manipulation, whether it's cultural manipulation, all of those things play into forcing someone into a marriage. And so just, being able to access mental health services, finances just to meet your day-to-day needs. And I mean, those are issues that generally all survivors are facing, is lack of housing availability, lack of basic needs, food, shelter, medical services. The fact that we as a state or even as a country don't have Medicare for all, like those are things that everyone should have access to, and it should not be dependent on someone else, of whether or not you get access to any of those things. Those are just, I guess, very high level things to look at. There's so much more, and I feel like I could keep you guys here for hours if I continued, so I'll leave it there.
Okay. We are almost coming to a close, and I wanted you all to have closing thoughts, but we have a question from the audience. So I'm going to ask two people to respond to the question from the audience, and then ask everyone to gather your thoughts and give us, your 30-second closing thoughts. So the question from the audience is, I'd love to hear panelists' thoughts about legal systemic failures for survivors and what can be done. Does pushing for legislative and policy change among the police and court systems seem like it could make a meaningful difference, or is it more promising to divest from those systems and explore alternative routes to justice? And so I feel like that's an Evelyn question. So, because we know Evelyn and transformative justice, that's in your area. And then if someone else would like to respond, And we are at about 10 minutes. So I do want to give everyone time to close. So Evelyn, please respond. And then if a second person would like to respond, if you can keep it to about a minute, that would be great.
Okay, this is a question that I have engaged in conversation a lot about. And I would start off by saying, if we think about the history of policing and the history of like what it was created to do, and we think about pushing for policy change and legislative change, can we really get at the root of the issue if we don't think about the history and what it was created for? So when we think about survivors and families and being in community and being in healthy relationships, I often hear survivors say that their parent was removed from the home, their loved one was removed from their community. And if we only have the responses to domestic violence through the criminal legal system, we are creating gaps in the community. We are ruining relationships. We are separating people from their loved ones. And if we think about everything that comes after, like being a survivor after having your loved one removed, oftentimes they want their family member to be able to come back. They want their family member to be able to change their behavior, change their attitudes. So how can we support survivors and their families in having healthy relationships, in having healthy communities, healthy engagement with one another? And oftentimes that comes from developing the skills to be able to be in relationship with each other, to be able to repair the harm that was caused, and to be able to move forward. And in schools here, for example, in Oakland, the police were removed from schools in 2020, and now these schools are focusing more on restorative justice practices and transformative justice practices. And statistics show that violence has reduced in that time. Young people are learning how to have healthy conflict with each other, are learning how to not run away from that conflict and try to repair the relationship so that we are able to be in community, be in loving relationships, and be in reciprocal relationships with one another.
Okay. Is there another panelist who'd like to respond before we move to closing thoughts?
I mean, I'd love to respond, and I can do you one better. I'll make it my closing thought. So I just want to say that it's absolutely an alternative. It's absolutely something that we need to focus our energy and thoughts on. And I think the question was, is that meaningful? And I would say 100%. And we know it's meaningful because survivors and families and communities ask us to do it every single day. And if we actually stop and listen to them, that is exactly where not only our time, energy, our capacity, and thoughts would be right there in that space with them and community-led practices. And that's the other piece, that there are models out there, and of course they're not perfected because they haven't all been happening and have the same level of funding, capacity, and energy driven towards them for the last 40 years as our traditional domestic violence shelter programs. But what I will say is that they absolutely are necessary, and it does make a difference. And that systems failures happen because we don't have an alternative. We don't have other options for folks for intervention practices. And that is something that we have to shift. We don't have another system. We don't have systems of care and mutual aid that truly can support communities in the middle of a crisis, and also that are community led and community driven. So that is truly what I care about at the end of the day, at the end of all of this and all of this time. And the thing that keeps me going decades and decades and decades after doing this work is the fact that we are seeing some community-led, community-driven, transformative practices that are all outside of traditional systems. And that is heartening. And it brings us closer to where we should be and closer to moving the needle. So I really appreciate it, and thank you so much for having me.
Jennifer, can you give us your closing thoughts?
My closing thought is, and I'm just gonna, because I see that there's another question here, I'm gonna just look at that, because it's asking about nonlinear journeys, and to recognize that the people we serve, they are on a journey, and it's doesn't look the same as the next person. You've worked with one survivor, and we need to be flexible, and we need to work with our systems to become more flexible and to be more accommodating and more inclusive of the people to whom we are responsible to. So thank you for having me today.
Thank you. Sadia, would you like to give us your closing thoughts?
I was actually going to do exactly what Jen did, which was try to answer the question that just came in. And I think part of that conversation is I agree 100% with what Jen said, but also just that, you know, many countries have different practices that work in one way or another, and there's always good in taking from others and learning from it and seeing how we can adapt ourselves and our cultures in a way that we are centering survivors. I think there's a practice, and I can't remember the country. It's in the Horn of Africa where when a mother gives birth, the whole community comes to ensure that, you know, all of her food and care is taken care of. They take care of her physical body, as in massage and other like therapeutic practices to help ensure a proper recovery after giving birth. There's so many things that they do to care for the mother in the first like 40 plus days after giving birth. And even in my own home culture in Pakistan, we have a very similar practice, but it has died down as society has shifted into these large, fast moving cities and so forth. But the reality is, as we support people in our communities, we realize that those were the practices that really ensured communal safety and, you know, a connectedness and a level of support that we have kind of lost touch with. And when we approach DV and all of these kind of issues within our society, the reality is a lot of our work needs to come from a place of community healing and not just, you know, momentary small bits of supports, but long-term ongoing support to really ensure comprehensive support. Like Julemi was mentioning earlier, like that comprehensive support, that one-stop shop where you can handle all of these things and not have to go to 5 different agencies, one to get legal help, one to get mental help, one to get physical help, one to, you know what I mean? So until we start looking at these things as all interconnected and like as, you know, the full support will not come from just that one singular thing that like this agency is supporting with, but it'll come from when we all start working together to really uplift the needs of the survivor and minimize the amount of effort they need to put into you know, jumping through hoops to get the services that they need. Really, the easier you make it for a survivor to get the support that they need, the easier it is to leave, the easier it is to, you know, take care of themselves, of loved ones, of, you know, whether they have educational passions, whether they have, you know, career passions, whether they, whatever passions that they might have, we can better support that when we start looking at these things as interconnected, as, you know, community support, and really like just providing that full nuanced wraparound support. I think that's the kind of thinking we need to start pushing when we're approaching these things. And part of this is working within the system that we're in and also trying to improve the system that we're in, knowing that, you know, we don't have any other alternatives. So we make the best of what we have and we try to keep improving it as much as we can, with the end goal in mind that we're trying to create a, you know, safer world for survivors and really like many on the panel said, work ourselves out of this job because nobody wants to keep working in this. We want this to end, you know.
Thank you. I know we're just going to be a bit over time, but Evelyn, if you can give us your concluding thoughts, and then we'll tie it off with Julemi. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, I don't have much more to add, but I would say we need to be expanding the way that we define domestic violence services and prevention into thinking about the different forms of violence that lead to violence in the home or that intensify violence in the home, and working with survivors, hearing what it is that they need, that they have to say, be listening to their feedback, their suggestions, and meeting them where they are.
Thank you. Julemi, can you bring us on home?
Yeah, so I just wanted to add that, you know, we all know that the legal system is not survivor-centered, right? So there's definitely a need for alternatives that focus on prevention and comprehensive approaches. We know that the current system is flawed and is ineffective, so there's obviously areas of improvement. And in order to do that, we need to critically evaluate the current system, its efficiency, and develop new policies that can bridge in the gap from the things that we discussed earlier, right? And it could involve like increasing successful programs or allocating funds from programs that are ineffective to like, I don't know, other programs that focus on prevention and things like that. And I also think that, you know, pushing for policies that enhance education around domestic violence for law enforcement agencies and judges, because they are the ones that play an important role in making critical decisions in these cases. So although we don't always want to go that route, that is an option for some people, and we want to make sure that the people handling these cases are well informed about domestic violence. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And I'd like to thank all of my panelists for agreeing to join us and talk about domestic violence and ways that we can improve systems, and just discuss domestic violence in a way that really does change how the conversation, how community reacts to domestic violence and talks about it, and how we talk about violence in general. Are we integrating that conversation into discussions everywhere? We should start from when kids are really young, teaching them how to deal with conflict and without becoming violent. That's where it starts. It has to start with families and spread out from there. And so I thank you for all of this information. We definitely want to continue these conversations about how we can get folks housed, how we can serve them long-term if we need to, get people to thriving, and improve our communities overall. So please join us in some of these later discussions that we'll be having over the next year. And definitely join us for conversations about Know Your Rights for your voting rights and how we can improve systems by electing people, electing ourselves to represent the community. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.